I think we're in a different ball game. We're in the post central bank absorption era, and we're now going to be in an environment where private investment will be competing head on with government borrowing, and it's not going to work out nearly as well as a lot of people might think.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm Thoughtful Money founder and your host, Adam Taggart. We're fortunate to speak today with a man who's really been everywhere. I'm talking, of course, about David Stockman, who was, if I recall correctly, David, I'm doing all this from memory. You were the youngest presidential cabinet member of the 20th century, where you served as the head of the Office for Management and Budget under President Reagan. You were also a U.S. House of Representative,
Yes.
a representative, I believe it was from the state of Michigan,
That's correct.
correct?
Your
All right.
memory's as good as mine. That was a long time ago.
Well,
So,
let's see if
yeah.
I can go three for three. You were
Yeah.
also a very early member of Blackstone, correct?
All right, that's correct. Actually, I started on Capitol Hill in 1970 as a aide to a congressman from Illinois. He became chairman of the Republican caucus. His name was John Anderson. So I had a pretty good, as a very young man, view of what was going on during the Nixon administration, the Ford administration. Then I ran for Congress in 1976 and lucked out in some way and won. I was 29 at the time. So I was a Michigan congressman during the Carter era. And then I joined up with Reagan in the 1980 campaign. By some flukish thing, I was chosen to be his sparring partner in the debate rehearsals for
Oh,
his
fun.
debate with both John Anderson, who ran as an independent, and Jimmy Carter, who obviously was the incumbent president. He practiced all his lines on me. He won the debate with Carter. He became president. He asked me to join the cabinet as energy secretary because I was into that issue at the time. And I said, no, I'd like to be OMB director. And he said, I'm not sure what that job is, but it sounds like you would be the right man. So that put me in really the catbird seat because obviously we were trying to quite drastically shift the direction of policy to, smaller government, lower taxes, less spending, more private sector, less state or government sector. And some of it was accomplished and a lot of roadblocks came up, but it was a pretty sort of defining experience for me. And then I went on to Wall Street. First I was at Salomon Brothers, the big bond trading house. I guess they
Mhm.
hired me because they figured I knew a lot about debt, federal debt, which by then was getting pretty big. And then I joined Blackstone and actually, was part of their private equity leverage buyout business. So I really got into debt. So, that covers a lot of territory, both in Washington and on Wall Street. And so I think it gives me a kind of different perspective than you get either from politicians or from Wall Streeters. I'm kind of a hybrid in some way.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I love talking to you, David, is you've sort of sat at every side of the table.
Yeah.
And you know how the people who sit on all the other sides, how they work and operate, because you've been in their worlds. And in fact, you still know some of the players themselves directly here. So to me, you've got one of the most informed insider perspectives because you've been in all these different worlds. You've been on the Congress side, you've been in the administration, you've been on Wall Street. You kind of know how all this works. It's funny you mentioned that they wanted you at Solomon because you knew a lot about federal debt, which you said was getting pretty big at the time. If we look back at the federal debt of the Reagan era now, like we almost need a microscope to see it.
Yeah.
It's so sad that pretty big back then is pretty tiny now. What's also interesting is, then you went on to do the LBO work as you talked about. So you've been in the debt world. I know few people that are less concerned about the debt than you right now. I mean, you're one of the most concerned people I know about the debt overhang and the entitlements overhang and whatnot. So it's funny that while you've spent your world in debt, you are one of the people that think we've got one of the biggest existential crises ahead of us because of the debt, correct?
Well, I guess if you absorb a lot about it and learn and know a lot about it, you might actually start to fear it more than people who say it's a number up there, it's a big number, it's growing, maybe someday they'll do something about it. But I think I've had kind of a unique journey because the first day as OMB director, the thing I learned, this is January 1981, was that we were almost up against the debt ceiling at the time, which was 930 billion. Okay. And the first thing that Reagan was going to have to do, whether he liked it or not, and he'd made a career running against big government, the public debt, and all of that, he was going to have to raise the public debt in the United States to over $1 trillion for the first time in history. And it was, it was a real sort of scary threshold, what terrible things might lie on the other side. Are we going to turn to a pillar of salt or something like that? But anyway, that was in 1981. Here we are, 40 some years later, 44 years later, the public debt is 37 trillion, but is just getting started in terms of the growth that is built into the pipeline, baked into the cake, as they say, because Congress is unwilling to do anything to change the fundamental direction of either the tax take, which is about 17% of GDP, or the spend level, which is about 24%. Now, when you have a 7% of GDP gap in an economy that's as big as ours is today, it's 30 trillion, you are adding enormous amounts to the public debt year after year. And that sort of brings us to the present juncture where we've just had this big, beautiful bill passed, by the Trump Republicans. They think it, is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But what it did was to say, we see this built-in debt, but rather than even making a token step towards shrinking it a little bit, they added on top $5.5 trillion over the next 10 years, on top of about 22 trillion that was already built in this base case I'm talking about, the 24% in spending and the 17% in revenue. Now, you may say, well, 10 years is a long time, but what I've learned since I started in this business in 1970, so that's a half century or more, is that 5-year, 10-year, even 30-year perspectives are actually important when it comes to the fiscal equation because there's so much stuff built in that takes years and years and even longer to change, even if you have the political will. Like Social Security, there's 70 million people on it now, retired or disability. That number will be 100 million people by the middle of the century. That's baked into the cake. The demographics are already there. The retirements are just waiting to hit, 68 and 70 and so forth. So the budget has got an enormous amount of momentum. You have to look at the longer term future. And when you do, the numbers are pretty scary. And that's sort of where I'm coming out. If I look at it not just on a 10-year basis, because as we'll get into in a moment, they found all kinds of gimmicks and all kinds of accounting tricks to make what they're doing on a 10-year basis, which is the standard budget horizon, look more cosmetic and less damaging than it is. But if you look out 30 years, there was built in, when they started this process a few months ago, there was built in another 130 trillion of public debt. I mean, that sounds like a staggering number.
Whoa.
Remember, right now we have 30 trillion of publicly held. The number you hear, 37 trillion, that's includes intergovernmental trust fund debt and so forth. But if we take the part that has to be financed, by bond buyers or by the Fed or by foreign investors, that's 30 trillion today. It would automatically have gone to 130 trillion by 2055 based on current policy. No change in entitlements, no change in taxes, and just funding government at the rate of inflation over time.
So
And
that's the autopilot number then. Autopilot, we get to
yeah,
130
good.
trillion.
Let's use that term. The autopilot number is 130 trillion at the end of the next 30-year horizon. So what did the big, beautiful bill do? And why do I call it the BUB bill, the big, ugly budget buster bill? What did it do? Well, that bill would add, as I just indicated, 5.5 trillion over the next 10 years. But when you lengthen out the horizon to 3 decades, 30 years, it would add 55 trillion more than was on that automatic pilot number. That is, it would take the public debt, this number is so staggering that it's almost hard to put your arms around, to 185 trillion by the 2054, the 30 years out. Now, the whole world economy today is only 105 trillion. The US economy is 30 trillion, and our debt is about 30 trillion as well. So you are talking about massive numbers that are driven by entitlements and demographics and an unwillingness in our country. And the reason I really focus on this, because I've been at this now for 40 years. So when I say I don't see them raising taxes anytime on the horizon ahead that I can look at, I say that out of experience. We have had about 17 to 18% of GDP in taxes, federal taxes, that's the revenue take, the tax take, since the early 1980s. It's gone up and down a little bit. During Clinton, it went up a little bit. The budget was balanced. And at various points where we've had big tax cuts, it's dropped even below 17% towards 16. But we can just say we know 30, 40 years of American politics of what some people call the uniparty rule, the bipartisan middle that really drives the whole thing. They can't get beyond 18% of GDP, 17% of GDP in revenue. I just don't see where it's coming from. It hasn't happened in that long period of time. Now, on the other hand, we know the demographics that are driving this huge entitlement system, and we can talk about that a little bit. I mean, Medicare, Social Security alone will cost 20-some trillion over the next decade, and you can add another 16 trillion for Medicare, and the numbers just keep building from there. But if you take all of those entitlements and the other normal functions of government, and the fact that we seem to want to be the policeman of the world with $1 trillion defense budget that they won't cut either. You could cut that thing massively, but they won't do it because there's a bipartisan consensus in favor of, fighting a war in Europe, in the Ukraine, fighting a war in the Far East if we have to defend Taiwan, having
building a golden
ships.
dome here.
Pardon?
Building
Yeah.
a golden dome here. That's
Yeah,
going to take a lot of
building a
money.
golden dome here, having 11 carrier battle groups spread, aircraft carrier battle groups spread all around the various blue waters of the planet. Well, when you add all that stuff up, it's $1 trillion, and then when you make allowance for inflation, that's 10 trillion of spending over the next decade as well. So what you end up with then is a very rigid, very, sort of immovable equation that is just inexorably driving towards these massive accumulations of public debt, which I don't believe can be absorbed much longer, because the one thing that made it possible since the 1980s is the Fed went into a money printing spree for a couple of decades. At the time that we were worried about a public debt of 1 trillion in 1981, the balance sheet of the Fed was 200 billion. Okay, and it recently it peaked, as a lot of viewers would know, at 9 trillion. All right, so that's a 45x gain over that period of time. All of that balance sheet ended up basically as government debt. That's, the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet. They bought all that debt up with credit they
Yep.
plucked out of thin air, or government guaranteed debt of the housing agencies. But it was that massive monetization of the public debt from the 80s through, let's say, 2022, March 2022, when they finally had to cry uncle and pivot to inflation fighting. The massive amount of debt that was absorbed during that period allowed us to get by. In other words, we didn't have crowding out, we didn't have soaring interest rates, we didn't have the day of reckoning because the Fed just kept lapping up on the margin. It was the buyer of last resort. And of course, what that further did was, pressure other central banks around the world to do the same. This is another big part of the equation. When the Fed went into this enormous expansionary mode from Greenspan's time in 1987 through March 2022, when they finally, as I said, had to throw in the towel, the other central banks of the world, the People's Bank of China, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Korea, the ECB, all the rest of them, were buying up US dollars and US Treasury securities as a defensive maneuver because they feared their exchange rates in this so-called floating rate world that we're in would go up, would appreciate, it would hurt their export industries. So, in a way, there's this thing we remember with our first encounter as a nation against foreigners when the British were impressing American sailors, taking them captive. I can remember reading about that with Thomas Jefferson. Basically, the Fed was impressing the other central banks of the world to help pay for the federal debt. And they did so, out of defensive necessity. So when you think about it, over that, let's say, 40-year period, it wasn't just the Fed's balance sheet that absorbed upwards of $8 trillion worth of government debt, but it was the balance sheet of all the other central banks, which then started to lap up the federal debt or other dollar-based securities as well. So if we go to the turn of the century, even the central banks of the world, most of them, if you add up the total, had a balance sheet of about 3 trillion. If you look at it now, it's about 45 trillion. Okay, so during that period of time, there's been a massive monetization of assets by central banks. In the process, a lot of the treasury paper got, swooped up because it is high quality stuff compared to the other dirty laundry, in the dry cleaners. But I think we've reached the point where that let's call it safety valve has run its course. The Fed had to stop printing. The other central banks have more or less slowed down or stopped. And so right now, as the new debt gushes out of the US Treasury, it's got to be purchased by real money, what I call real money savers, not by central banks, which have been the dominant player on the margin for 3 decades. Now it has to be absorbed by real money savers in the bond pits. And there just isn't enough to go around unless we start to crowd out and force up interest rates that are faced by the private sector. So as I then summarize, I think we're in a different ballgame. We're in the post central bank absorption era, and we're now going to be in an environment where private investment will be competing head on with government borrowing, and it's not going to work out nearly as well as a lot of people might think.
Okay, and so why is that? What is the limiter here that is now forcing that? Is it inflation?
Yeah, I think it is because, we had all this confidence. Remember all the speeches? I think Bernanke gave a famous speech. It was about if I remember right, December 204, in which he was basically crowing that after a few decades, and by a few decades, I mean since 1971, when, Camp David and we went off the gold standard and the central bankers now were free to do what they thought was best. But he said, we've mastered the art of central banking. We have inflation permanently, in a slot of 2% or below. We're really, the great savior of the world economy. And I think he called it the great, what did he call it? It was the great moderation or something like that. But anyway, there was so much confidence that inflation wasn't a problem that when it finally just exploded after 2020 and 2021 and the massive stimulus bills that were put through in response to the pandemic, and then all the crazy rate of central bank expansion that occurred with it, all of a sudden inflation was running 6, 7, 8%, on the top line or headline number, and you could find even bigger or higher levels if you really dug into it and took some of the tricks out of the inflation index. So this was a shock. This was not supposed to happen. And as everyone knows, on a year-over-year basis, it peaked in June 2022 at 9%. And I think that created a shock in the central banking ranks. And remember, it's not that fraternity isn't that big. There's probably a few hundred people around the world that run the ECB, the Fed, Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China, and all of them were shocked. So I don't say that they're done printing, that they've put the printing press, so to speak, into retirement or some kind of permanent lockup. But I think there is a totally new reluctance to engage in the kind of open-ended, money printing, balance sheet expansion, credit creation that they had no reluctance to do. Remember, in the spring of 1980, they were just in the spring of 2020 during the pandemic, they were just flooding the market. They were buying 120 billion worth of bonds a month. I mean, just think of that. That's a 1.2 trillion run rate of new high-powered central bank credit or money. So I think that behavior that we have seen in every crisis from 1987 in the meltdown to the two great financial crises in 07, 08, to the pandemic crisis in the spring of 2020 and some lesser ones in between. I think the mindset that was working then has been shocked and altered when the inflation really almost got totally out of control. So we're going to have what I would call instead of the great moderation, as Bernanke called it, we might have the great reluctance with capital G and capital R era of central banking going forward for many years ahead. And that will make for a new ball game, because if they're not printing the credit, it's got to come out of private savings. And as we know, there is precious little private savings either in the US economy or most of the other developed economies of the world.
Okay. So one would interpret that to be then more disinflationary, deflationary going forward. Let me ask you this, David, and if I'm incorrect with that conclusion, please change my mind. But let me just try to channel the administration here for a second. So one, I know you don't like President Trump and you don't like a lot of his policies. Let's even put aside your thoughts of him as a person. You don't like a lot of his policies and what he's doing.
Oh no, the person thing is the least of it.
I know.
The policies are, they're terrible, and they're really.
Well, wait, let me ask my question, then I'll let you run.
Yeah.
So, his Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent. First, I'd love to get a sense just of what you think of Bessent as a talent. But if I listen to Bessent a lot, and what I think he would say is, David, you're right. We're not going to be reducing the deficit that much, in the near term here. We have hopes that through some other things over time, maybe we'll get more of control of it. But what we're really focused on is driving growth. And what we want to get down, a priority in the near term is to get the debt to GDP ratio working back down again. I think he's back to a 3% target. And he says that's really going to provide a lot of relief. That's going to make the debt overhang less burdensome because we're growing at a faster rate. And if we can keep that momentum going, then things should be fine. What would your answer to that be?
Yeah, that's good. And I think it's a great question, but it gets into some complicated math, some history. And first of all, when he says, his formula is 3, 3, and 3 or something like that. But he means the deficit only needs to be reduced to 3% of GDP per year. The theory is the economy will grow at 3% a year. And so at minimum, you will stabilize the debt at its current level. And therefore, these horror stories that I've been, projecting in this conversation might be prevented.
Right.
See,
And
the
so, sorry to
problem,
interrupt, but the other 3%, is that 3% on the Treasury? Is that a Treasury yield goal? What was the other 3%?
it's a good question. I think one of it, part of the other three was energy production growth of
Okay.
3%. He had some kind of 3% equation. But see, the problem is, why would you think stabilizing the debt at the current level, which is about 100% of GDP, is a perfect answer? Because if that's true, what in the hell was Ronald Reagan, myself, and others doing, and Don Reagan, who was another Wall Streeter who took the same job, Treasury Secretary, he was Merrill Lynch CEO. What were we doing in 1980 when the public debt was 30% of GDP? I mean, were we totally benighted? Were we sort of living in some 19th century world where we didn't know that at 30% to GDP, the debt was not near where it should be? It should be 100%. So let it rip. Keep borrowing for the next 2, 3, 4 decades till you get up to 100%. So, it's kind of a rationalization for the status quo. Why is 100% stable, sustainable, productive, consistent with growth? And second, can you keep it there anyway?
Right.
My answer is I've watched the politics enough, and when we gave up the idea of a balanced budget, I think it was all over except the shouting. Because a balanced budget, people can understand what that is. You live within your means, and I know this is supposedly primitive rhetoric from household, and the Keynesians will say the household economics are irrelevant to public. It's a lot of baloney. The Keynesians have not succeeded. Their Keynesian policy, either at the Fed or at the fiscal level, hasn't succeeded. And so I think that 3% is sort of a rationalization for saying, well, it's 6 to 7% today, so it's really not too bad. It's only double what it should be. And give me 10 years and maybe I can get back to 3%. And that assumes nothing bad happens in the interim. Now, I was giving you these numbers before, but let me just say this, okay? Remember I said the automatic pilot scenario for the next 30 years, and remember, we got an old population, the baby boom retiring, the demographics are built in. We got 80 million people that are going to be getting their Social Security, Medicare checks, and so forth. So the 30 years, isn't a crazy thing to look at. But we only end up, not with the big budget, beautiful bill, that takes us way up. But with the automatic pilot, the current status quo, we end up with 130 trillion of debt by the mid 2050s. But I think it's important to say what is presumed to get even to the 130 trillion level. Well, what's presumed is there is never a recession for 40 years. There is no flare-up ever in inflation beyond the 2% mark, which the Fed, is painted on the wall somewhere. there is never any flare up of interest rates in real terms beyond 1%, which means the weighted average treasury yield is about 3.5%
Right.
over that
So
period. And the
it's
last thing that's important is that in 30 years, Congress does not adopt one new program or increase spending by one dime for anything.
oh my God.
And that all of the gimmicks that they've built into the budget, like tax cuts that expire 2 or 3 years down the road, you get 2 or 3 years down the road, and they say, oh my God, we can't let taxes go up tomorrow. So they get extended and extended and extended. Well,
Yeah.
the budget is just riddled with these kinds of tricky accounting things that make the deficit look smaller than it really is. And I'm talking about all the tricks. So the what that projection is saying is that all of these tricks expire. All of these tax cuts expire, all these spending increases, temporary spending increases expire, and we have perfect sailing in economic weather for, I say 4 decades, because the last recession obviously was in 2020. You get to 2055, you haven't had a recession. Now,
Right.
you
So
assume
it's basically
all of
it's a
those
Goldilocks
things.
fantasy that
Yeah,
can't be achieved.
yeah.
And even
But
with
you see,
Goldilocks
you
fantasy, we're at
assume all of
130
those.
trillion.
Yeah, you assume all of those things, and you got 130 trillion. You make some allowance for some crazy development in the Persian Gulf and the oil market blows up and oil prices go to $200 a barrel for a few years and everything gets discombobulated, or you have a political upheaval somewhere and government falls apart. There's many things that could happen, obviously, that have happened in our lifetime. All the crises, none of them we really saw coming, 208, 220, all the ones in between. So if you start layering in some of the kind of bad things that happen in the real world, it's far worse than the 130. And now they said, we'll see your 130 trillion and we'll add 55. So really they now set us. This is why last week or 2 weeks ago when they passed the bill and Trump signed it with great, ceremony. They basically said, we'll see your 130 trillion and we'll raise you to 185 trillion, because that's the path we're on until something big and major either boosts the revenue level or shrinks the spending take at 24% of GDP. That's where we're heading.
So David, I know you don't like Trump's policies and you think well, I know you probably didn't love Biden's policies either, but you're not loving what Trump's doing, and you just gave us a sense of like, look, even making the most generous of assumptions, it gets bad in the next 30 years. And the one big beautiful bill, or the bub bill, as you call it, makes it even worse. But that's looking through the lens of the administration we have. How much more or less concerned do you get if this doesn't work and then President Mamdani gets in? So I'm interviewing you from New York, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. If the political pendulum were to shift, hard to the progressive side, because people are like, all right, we tried it Trump's way, it didn't fix the issue. Now let's go all the way to the Democratic Socialist side. How much worse does that make it, if at all, in your eyes?
I doubt it would make it much worse. The reason is the Republicans have been on this kick, cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes. It's magic. It'll pay for itself. That's a lot of baloney. It's never happened. We could go into all the math of that as well. But they have created a revenue baseline that is so minimal at the federal level anyway. It is 17% of GDP. When I was putting the Reagan budget together, we were up against 20% of GDP going to 24%, because back in those days we had high inflation and there was no indexing of the tax brackets. So the brackets, people got put, it was called bracket creep back in those days. People were being pushed up rapidly into higher brackets. So the revenue take was on automatic pilot towards 24%. Well, we're at 17. Okay. So the Republicans have pushed it into what I would call the sub-basement of plausibility. So if the liberals take over or the quasi-socialists, they're going to have the same financing challenge. And I don't think they're going to find much room to raise spending. Now, they might try to raise taxes on the rich, which they'll find they're not going to get very far because, right now, 80% of federal revenue is paid for, of the income tax is paid for by the top 20% of taxpayers. And the top 5% pay, 40% of taxes. So they're not going to find a lot of extra change by raising taxes even further on the top 10, 20% that are already paying all of the income taxes. They're not going to raise the payroll tax materially because that's already pretty onerous. They're afraid of sales taxes because allegedly that's regressive and hits the average guy or the poor guy. So I don't see that they can raise much tax, and if they can't raise much tax in ways that they would find acceptable, I don't think they're going to have much pocket change to spend either. In other words, the last big token to socialism in America was Obamacare. They barely got that through. They used a lot of trickery in their budget projections to make it, plausible, passable. And I think that's it. They're done. And you can get some real left progressives in there if you want. I don't think we'd ever elect one. The red state, blue state electoral college just isn't going to elect Mamdani. They might get back into power, and you would get a Biden-type Democrat, Washington swamp, a set of professionals who will try to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and have a lot of investigations about how bad Trump and the Republicans were. But I don't think they'll make it much worse. They won't fix it. They won't cure it. So what you have then is a Democratic Party that's lost, will never address this fiscal problem in any way, shape, or form, and a Republican Party that is totally delusional and believes if they just cut taxes enough, it'll go away, which after 40 years, they ought to be able to look at the data and realize that is complete, hogwash.
So, David, one thing that would be really interesting, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but I did recently interview Art Laffer, who interestingly held the same position as you, running the OMB back in.
Oh, he actually did. And he was an economist, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he has, I think, he's much more of the view that you were just mentioning, that, hey, look, we make the tax cut permanence, we deregulate, we do all these other things, and that's going to let a million flowers bloom, and that's going to get us to where we want to be. So he's got a much more, I would say, sanguine outlook from the current administration's policies. It would be really interesting just to have a discussion between the two of you of where you see similarities and where you see differences. Like I said, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm pretty sure that's something the audience would be interested in if it was something the two of you were open to.
Oh, I would be. And I'm sure he would be. He's for the last 45 years, he's been totally certain that the Laffer curve is valid, and that that I have the wrong approach because he called me the patron saint of the root canal theory of politics. In other words, you got to cut spending, you got to injure interest groups, you've got to make the broad public unhappy with Medicaid cuts and Social Security cuts and veterans benefit cuts and pork barrel cuts. And there's an easier way to do it, according to Art. Now, just cut taxes and the economy will ride off into the sunset, and the revenue will flood the treasury and everything will be better. Well, when he said that, okay, he's been saying that since January 1981. In January 1981, the debt was 1 trillion. It is now 37 trillion. By the time he even got into office the next time around, the next president, if he was an advisor, it's going to be north of 50 trillion and heading towards these very big numbers that I mentioned. So there's no way you can make the math of it work for this reason. There's two reasons. One, We're now taxing. You know, if you had 90% World War II tax brackets against, you know, at least the upper income, and you lowered it to 50, you would probably get a lot of revenue. That's the Laffer curve is totally valid. In fact, Ronald Reagan used to tell a great story, which validated the Laffer curve, but also tells you why it's not relevant at the present time. He said, you know, when we were at when he was at the peak of his career in Hollywood during World War II, and Roosevelt had 90% taxes above, I forget what the level was, but it wouldn't be that high today, above a couple 100,000 in today's dollars. He said we would make one film and then we would quit working for the year because the next film would cost us 90%. It wasn't worth doing.
Right.
Well, you know, the point is when you have a 90% tax rate, of course the Laffer curve works. But we have right now a 37% marginal rate on the highest level. We have an average tax rate of 17%. And for the overwhelming 140 million people, 160 million households, there's 160 million income tax filers, and 140 million of them pay almost no federal income tax at all, or at a rate of less than 10%. So in the great body of the economy today, there are no 90% rates, there are 10% and lower. And it just doesn't have the marginal rate reduction doesn't have the same kick. Now, to go back to the math, so therefore, if you're taxing, let me just round it to make it easier for all of us to envision, even if the tax rate on average were 20%, it means that $1 of tax cuts has to generate $5 of additional GDP in order to break even, because out of that $5, you'll get $1 worth of tax at 20%, and you're back to square one. Well, there isn't any evidence that in today's debt-ridden and aging workforce economy, with all the other negative things that are going on in terms of bad results from Fed policy, you know, a lot of speculation and bubbles and so forth. There's no evidence that you can get $5 of economic reflow for every dollar of tax cut. It's just not there. It's not going to happen. That's the first thing. The second point that I would make with him is the true effect of supply side tax cuts. And frankly, what is in the big, beautiful bill is not supply side, it's just continuing a tax cut that's already there. So there wouldn't be any incremental effect anyway. It would be the same thing we've had since 2017. But the key point is that true supply side incentive based tax cuts should change the mix of GDP, but not the level of nominal GDP. In other words, if nominal GDP is growing at 4% and you have 3% inflation and 1% real growth, if we do have an effective supply side incentive, what you'll do is get less inflation, more real growth. So if you're comparing real growth to real growth, you'll go from 1% to 2%, let's say. And that's a big step up, obviously. Yep. But it'll have no effect on revenue because we don't tax real income, we tax nominal income. And if the nominal GDP growth rate stays at 4%, we'll get the same amount of revenue as regardless of the mix of real and inflation in the GDP. So if you take those two factors together, the low average rate on the economy and the fact that supply side should encourage a more productive mix of real versus inflation, real growth versus inflation, you don't get much revenue. Now, in the old days, the Keynesians said, yeah, but if we get stronger growth, that means there'll be fewer people unemployed, more people working, and therefore the spending for the safety net, unemployment insurance and other things will fall, and that helps the budget. Now, that was true in what I call a workfare economy. But we're in a welfare economy today in which, over the next 10 years, we'll spend $55 trillion on Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, and other welfare programs that don't go to workers. Okay. And on unemployment
And
insurance.
sorry to interrupt, but that's if AI doesn't put like tens of millions of more out of work
Yeah,
over
that's
that period
true.
of time.
We can throw that in. But just in the what you call the automatic pilot, there's 55 trillion of welfare spending over the next decade, but there's only 300 billion of unemployment insurance. So if we got significantly better real growth than CBO is forecasting, they're always beating up on CBO, uh, it would reduce that 300 billion by a little bit, but it's not going to affect the 55 trillion over 10 years at all because that's all retired people, disabled people, young people, old people, and people that aren't working. So in what I would call a welfare state economy, growth does very little to reduce spending, and it does almost nothing to raise revenue. So the fundamental idea that you can grow your way out of these massive deficits in today's world, maybe 1950, yes, but in 2025, that you can grow your way out is fundamentally completely wrong, defies the math, is not analytically supportable, and that's the story.
All right. Well, I follow your logic there. I'm not smart enough to intuit what Dr. Laffer's response to it would be, but I appreciate the fact that you're open to a discussion. Folks, if you're interested in what's happening between these two great minds, let me know in the comments section below. If interest is high enough, I will reach out to both to see if it's something we can make happen. And David, like I said, I know I'm springing this on you, so my apologies for that, but we'll see what happens from here. I just appreciate you being open to it. All right, I'm looking at the time, David. I've got to get one last key theme in here, which is sort of the so what, the practical aspects of this. So having shared with us your thoughts of the future and the current road that we're on, which is not good. It's not leading to improvements. It's leading to a worsening of the situation. Are there any investment themes that come out of this that you think would be practically useful to this audience?
Well, I would like to be more constructive and practical, but I think if you recognize that the current policy matrix is going to fall apart, and that there'll be a crisis of central banking, and you're already seeing it coming. I mean, day by day, it gets even more intense about is Trump going to fire Powell, yes or no, or maybe. We're going to have a whole confrontation with the central bank. We're going to have public debt that is hard to finance, crowding out, rising interest rates, all kinds of conflict. I think what that will do is create so much turbulence and uncertainty in the main financial markets that will be an unsafe place to be. And so, what's the alternative? Well, when central banking money falls apart, the world probably has no choice except to go back to real money, which is gold. So I think that is a haven of tremendous opportunity, not because I want to speculate and say, well, it went from 1,700 to 3,400, now it's going to 6,800, and after that, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's going up, and it's going to be a place where people will retreat to as the status quo unwinds. Also, I think in the short run, the government isn't going to default. And in order to, make the markets clear, the Fed is going to have to keep overnight rates and short rates up pretty high, 4%, 5%. So on liquid investments, you're not going to make a fortune, but you're going to get paid, a reasonable amount of money, given there's no price risk, duration risk, and you can play that by the day, the week, and the year. So I think cash returns on rental properties, cash returns on short-term government paper, and the safe haven of gold are probably the three places I would think of that would make sense in the kind of world that we're running, that we're heading into.
Okay. So basically, hard assets that have intrinsic value that can't be inflated away. And then for liquidity, the safety of short duration instruments like T-bills.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Okay, David, look, I mean, I could keep going with you forever. And I do want to note for folks that haven't heard me already talk about it or don't follow me on X, but you and I were both at Rick Rule's annual symposium in Boca Raton, Florida last week. And it was a great event, but we had the pleasure of taking an evening cocktail cruise together. And I had the great pleasure of sitting at a table with you and Frank Trotter, who's one of the co-founders of Battle Bank. And we had some great discussions, but it was a real treat for me to listen to you and Frank kind of talk about the old days and a lot of the, the great personages that you guys got to interact in your career. I think Frank was telling us that Hyman Minsky was an advisor to one of his businesses. You obviously had great stories from the Volcker era and stories from Reagan. So that was just a real treat. So thank you. You told me one story, which I'll edit out if you don't want to share it here publicly, but it really did stick with me about you were walking, I think through the White House or whatever, and George Bush.
Back to the executive office building, which is next door. Yes, where the vice president's
do you mind sharing that
offices.
one little anecdote with
Well,
folks here?
and we had just had an economic briefing by the Treasury Department, which at the time was totally bifurcated between the supply-siders, who were just all about tax cuts and fiscal policy, and the monetarists, who thought everything was driven and determined by the Fed and exactly the rate of money growth to the decimal point. And we just had a briefing by the Undersecretary of the Treasury, who was a hardcore monetarist and who was ranting and raving that there wasn't, that we're going to be in trouble. We're going to have a recession because the Fed is too tight. They ought to be expanding the money supply, like at 5% versus 4.1% or something like that. So he just kept pounding that they've got to start using the printing press. That's what it's there for. You got to tell Volcker, crank up the printing press. So on the way back, I was walking with Vice President Bush, who wasn't his field was foreign policy, not economics. And he kind of asked me on the way, he said, well, is it true there's actually a printing press in the basement of the Treasury building? So anyway, I realized right then that economic policy wasn't his forte.
Well, let me ask you this, because I've made this point a lot. So I think one of the things people who generally, people with your background, an economics background, who go to Capitol Hill, one of the things you realize quickly is, whoa, not everybody here who's making decisions has a good degree of financial literacy or economic literacy. And I think that's a really telling example where the vice president was like, do they actually have a real printing press in their basement? That was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you think the level of financial literacy on Capitol Hill is around the same, or has it evolved or devolved in those 50 years?
Well, it was pretty low back then, so it's hard to think it got any worse. But I don't see any great improvement. There's a couple of guys in the Congress who really understand, I think, fundamentals of economics. Senator Rand Paul in the Senate, Congressman Tom Massey in the House. So it's not surprising that Trump is now spending millions of dollars to try to defeat him in a primary, because he seems to understand economics. Okay, but in any case, there aren't many. And maybe that's a telling tale. If the one guy who actually has a pretty decent grasp of how markets work, how money works, how fiscal policy works, what central banking is all about, Tom Massey, Congressman Tom Massey from Kentucky, if the Republican president, who's allegedly going to bring us a new era of golden age of prosperity through Trumponomics, is trying to drive this guy out of office, in a primary, it tells you we're probably even lower in terms of average literacy than even back then in the 1980s.
Yeah, I mean, personally, from at least what I've heard, and again, I haven't spent time there, it has gotten worse. And I guess I got sort of two questions for you about this. One in general is like you would almost hope that we would, we would have some sort of standard testing, probably on several different topics, but like once you got elected to Congress, right, we probably want you to be able to pass some sort of basic,
Yeah.
economic fundamentals test just to know that you're going in there with at least a grounding, in some of these big decisions you're going to make. Love to hear if you think that would be a good thing or not. But let me ask my other question first. Um, uh, I worry that we might have been there even back in your era, but we've certainly moved to the era of numbers that are so large, the human mind really truly can't fathom them. Like really trying to understand how big a trillion is.
Hmm.
Some people can kind of conceptually get it, but it's really such a big number that it exceeds our ability to really understand it. And so we have people that are just making decisions kind of on the fly. COVID, great example. Well, all right, I mean, how much stimulus should we do? I don't know, 2 trillion, let's do 4 trillion, right? 5 trillion, right? They just don't understand how gargantuan that number is, but also like what the second order effects are going to be like. Oh my God, what's that debt going to be like to service as time goes on, especially as compounding kicks in? And I just fear we're at this level in time where we have people who don't have the grounding in the fundamentals, making decisions at order of magnitudes that even really smart people can't comprehend. And I just don't know how this ends well when you have that sort of toxic mix together.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I would point the finger at the culprit in all of this, which is the Federal Reserve.
Mhm.
Because if you go back 100 years, the level of literacy in Congress in 1925 probably wasn't much higher. The Secretary of the Treasury then was a brilliant man, and he had a president who understood economics. That was Coolidge at that point. But I would say on average, and I've read a lot of history and I've written books about it and so forth, I don't think it was much higher than it is today. But what you didn't have was a Federal Reserve that was willing to come in and monetize the debt, buy up all the bonds, keep interest rates artificially low, so that the consequence of, fiscal profligacy didn't, hit the hometown economies back home. And I can even remember when I was in Congress in the 70s, and we would drive Tip O'Neill nuts, our young guys, us young Republican deficit hawks, give speeches on the House floor telling all the horrible things that were going to happen from the deficit, because back then bad things did happen. Okay.
Mhm.
So what I'm saying is that if we had honest financing of the public debt, no money printing at the Fed. It's coming out of the savings pool, which isn't very large. It's going to crowd out private investment. The car dealer back home is going to pay more to finance his floor plan. The businessman is going to pay more to borrow money to buy equipment. Back then, there were checks and balances that flowed from policy into economic life on Main Street that created a political constituency for restraint, for balanced budgets, and on the fiscal issue. But once the Fed, under Greenspan, got into the big time monetization business and basically sopping up the Treasury issuance, that ended. And then we got an era where the uniparty competed in a very bad way. The Democrats for more and more spending, the Republicans for less and less revenue, and both parties for more wars and more defense. And the Fed made it all happen. And if you hadn't had the Fed taking its balance sheet from 300 billion, which is what Greenspan inherited, to 9 trillion over, only 30 years, we would have had, I think, a totally different policy mix during that period of time. So literacy is important, but I think the institutional arrangement is even more important. And if we can get the Fed out of the business of, unbalancing the political equation, the fiscal equation, things wouldn't be nearly as dire as they are under the current arrangement.
arrangement. Okay, so if we didn't have, you're more concerned about the impact of the Fed, which we could call here maybe the great enabler.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Yep, that's the right word.
But it doesn't seem like that's going to change anytime soon. I don't detect you've got hope that we're going to replace the Federal Reserve regime, anytime soon willingly.
Yeah, but let me say this, probably the worst combination I can think of is fiscal economic illiteracy in Congress in combination with money printers in the Eccles building a few blocks away. That's a deadly combination.
That's the
And
toxic
somehow
combo.
that needs to be on disconnected and unwound in some way or another.
Okay. And if I took good notes here, even though you don't necessarily think they're going to, dismantle the Fed or anything like that anytime soon, you do see us entering this era, which maybe we're already in, the great reluctance, just meaning the
Yeah.
Federal Reserve is not going to be as able to enable as they have in the past because of the
Yeah.
inflation fear.
They're going to be much more reluctant, far more reluctant. And hopefully that will begin to bring back the bond vigilantes, as we used to call them in the old days, and bring back the local constituency who would write letters. I used to get dozens and hundreds of them. The deficit is hurting my business. What congressman in the last few years got a letter from any constituent complaining that the deficit was hurting his business? And it's kind of hard to imagine, but back 40 years ago when I was in Congress, we got those kind of letters, and
Well,
that's what we need to restore.
all right. Well, we'll end it on that important point. David, thank you. This has been every bit as fascinating as I had expected it would be. For folks that have really enjoyed this discussion and would like to follow you and your work between now and the next time you come on this channel, where should they go?
Well, I publish a daily newsletter. It's called David Stockman's Contra Corner. You can easily find that just on Google. And it's a subscription-based newsletter. I write about all these issues: fiscal, monetary, Wall Street, stock market, the Federal Reserve, foreign policy, the war in Ukraine. A whole range of things that all, one way or another, circle back to these big framework questions that we all live in, whether we're in, finance or just normal life.
All right. Well, it's a fantastic publication. David, when I edit this, I'll put the link up here on the screen so folks know exactly where to go. Folks, the link will also be in the description below this video, so you can get there with one click if you like. You've been kind in the past, David, to share one of your reports or two with my premium Substack audience through the Macro Pass service here. We got to get another report from you soon, and we'll push it out to that audience as well. So, of course, those are the premium subscribers of the Thoughtful Money Substack. But it is
Definitely,
a
we'll
fantastic
do
publication.
that.
Awesome.
Good, very good, and great to discuss all these things with you.
All right. Well, in wrapping up here, folks, if you've enjoyed this discussion with David as much as I have, please let him know that by hitting the like button, then clicking the subscribe button below. As a reminder, folks, please do, if you haven't subscribed yet, do take just a quick second to hit that subscribe button. 3 reasons why. One, it's my birthday at the end of the month, and I'm really trying to get as close as possible to 150,000 subscribers for this channel by then. One, because it would be a fun thing to celebrate. But more importantly, you'll benefit because if you subscribe to the channel, you get alerted every time we publish a new video. That way you won't be missing future videos. But also the YouTube algorithm gives this channel more love the more subscribers that we have. So you're helping basically get content like this out to a greater range of like-minded investors just like you who are just trying to, stay on top of everything that's happening and make prudent investing decisions. So you can help with that movement by that 1-second commitment of clicking that like button. Also, David has talked about a challenging future lying ahead, both over the next couple of decades, but increasingly in the near term here. So to try to figure out how to shepherd your wealth safely through that, I recommend that most people watching this channel do so following the guidance of a good financial advisor, a good professional financial advisor, but importantly, one that takes into account the macro considerations that David has shared with us here. If you've got a good one who meets those criteria, great. Don't mess with success. Stick with him. But if you don't, or you just like a second opinion from one who does, then consider scheduling a free consultation with one of the financial advisors that Thoughtful Money endorses. These are the firms you see with me on this channel week in and week out. To schedule one of those consultations, just fill out the very short form at thoughtfulmoney.com. As a reminder, these consultations are totally free. There's no commitment to work with these firms. It's just a free service that these firms offer to be as helpful as they can to as many people as possible. All right, David. Well, like I said, just such a joy and a privilege. Really look forward to having you back on the channel soon.
Okay, very good. Great.
All right. And everybody else, thanks so much for watching.